You're listening to the Quint's podcast.
In response to Russia's growing incursions and attacks, Ukraine has now taken the legal route and brought the issue front and center of the UN's highest court, the International Court of Justice, on 7th March, urging the judges to issue an injunction demanding Putin to end the invasion. At the ICJ, the Ukrainian delegation accused Moscow of putting quote-unquote millions in danger and for defiling the Genocide Convention by falsely claiming that Ukraine was committing genocide against Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine as one of the pretexts for its invasion. However, not surprisingly, Russia did not show up for that hearing on Monday, effectively boycotting the hearing. Apart from this, 39 countries have also referred the ongoing crisis in Ukraine to the International Criminal Court, or ICC, a separate entity that has the power to investigate genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. This court has now opened an investigation as well. However, it is important to note that both Ukraine and Russia are not signatories of the ICC, thus putting a question mark on how effective an ICC investigation will eventually be. Further, Russia's absence at the ICJ also casts doubt over the extent to which international legal mechanisms can be effective. But the bigger question here is, how likely is President Vladimir Putin or anyone else involved in the invasion of Ukraine to stand trial? To understand exactly how the ICJ and the ICC work and the legal remedies that Ukraine possibly has, joining me today is Vakasha Sachdev, the Quint's legal editor. You're tuned in to The Big Story, the podcast where we dissect the headline-making news for you, and I'm your host, Himmat. Welcome back, Vakasha, to the Big Story podcast. And today we are discussing a big topic today, the ICJ. So thank you so much for coming in.
No, always a pleasure to be here, Himmat. And yeah, this is something which I've been a huge fan of international law from the time I was a kid. And one rarely gets to ever talk about it because international law ends up being quite useless in the long term. So it's good to have a chance to finally get to discuss it.
Yeah. So the big one coming in is that Ukraine is taking a legal route to get Russia to at least provisionally stand down. So and we're hearing courts like International Court of Justice and International Criminal Court as well. So can you explain how does the International Court of Justice actually work? Is it similar to courtrooms in India? What kind of crimes do they prosecute?
So what you have to understand is that the International Court of Justice is a unique forum. Okay, it's not the same. So that our listeners also clear at the outset, the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court are very different kinds of entities. They do very different things, and they don't come about in the same way. The International Court of Justice was founded at the same time as the UN, and the idea behind it was that. Okay, so prior to the formation of the UN, prior to your world wars, what would happen, right? If a country didn't like what another country would do, they would try maybe diplomatic negotiations. And then after that, okay, you know what? No other option, let's go to war. The disputes between countries often were about technical things. Oh, you violated this treaty which we had, or oh, you were supposed to do XYZ, which is part of a customary international practice, and you didn't do it. You know what? So now we have a problem. And the idea of the International Court of Justice was that instead of having countries to just slug it out with each other over these kind of issues, you have a neutral court, an actual courtroom which follows procedure, which has a dedicated set of judges, has a whole set of how it functions, and operates on the basis of international law, that this kind of court would be able to settle those disputes. So that was the idea behind the International Court of Justice. So when the UN Charter was signed, pretty much everyone who was party to the UN Charter, which was all the countries around the world at that time, they all also signed on to the statute of the International Court of Justice. Now, the thing to understand is that, again, because this is a court which has to deal with things between two countries, two states, the way it operates is slightly different. You have to, once you're a party to the statute, you can now go and file a case in the ICJ saying, oh, this country has done XYZ and this, and I have a dispute and I want it to be settled by the court. The person against whom the case is brought has to if to really effectively have them be able to come in and function, they have to agree to be there. Okay, because the whole way international law, everything works on agreement and consensus and those kind of things, right? So you can't. So it's not as though someone says, "Oh, I'm filing this case," and then immediately that means that the court will be able to serve a summons the way that happens in a domestic court, and that forces the other party to be there. This is something which we've seen, right? With as you might have heard from yesterday's hearing, that Ukraine has filed this case in the ICJ against Russia, and Russia is like, we're not going to be there. So that's sort of one of the sort of pitfalls of having to have a system like, an international court system, because it relies on the parties being together. But the basic idea then is that, look, for the ICJ, a country takes another country to the ICJ. It's not that you take individuals or you take like small groups within a country who've done something wrong. No, it's one country has to take another country. That's the only way it works. And what they do is that they will say, look, so that when a country does that, they say, look, there is XYZ principle of international law, which is binding on us and this other country. This principle of law is something which the ICJ can look at. It's it's within the scope of international law as the ICJ considers it. So the ICJ statute has a definition of what international law can include. And you know what? There's a prima facie case here. They have violated it, so therefore we brought them here. Now, sometimes countries can be like, yeah, you know what? I don't think this was right. I will defend myself here, and we'll see what happens. Sometimes countries are just like, we won't turn up. That's but even if a country says they're not going to turn up, the ICJ can still conduct the proceedings without them being there and then pass an order. But then obviously whether that can get enforced, we then have to look into the enforcement of court decisions, which we will come to in a bit. So basically, just the key thing to remember at the outset is the International Court of Justice deals with disputes between states. Now, these can be a whole variety of disputes. It could be like, we had a treaty to all countries have signed, for instance, the Vienna Convention on diplomatic relations, consular relations, pretty much, right? Now, if a country fails to follow through with that, like suppose it arrests a diplomat, right, who has diplomatic immunity, or it doesn't provide consular access to a national from another country, which is what happened with India and Pakistan, right, with the Kulbhushan Jadhav case. Then they can say, look, there is an international, the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations. That is it's a binding treaty on all these countries. This country has violated that. Therefore, we have a dispute. They have to pay reparations to us, or they have to like reverse what they've done in because of their violation. So, like for instance, when India took Pakistan, they didn't give Jadhav consular access. He wasn't able to therefore have a fair trial. So his trial needs to be redone. And in the meanwhile, make sure that you don't have follow through of any of the original verdicts where they were sentencing him to death and stuff. So that's sort of the way a court dispute at the International Court of Justice will work. The ICJ does have another form of jurisdiction as well, where a country can approach it for a legal opinion as well. So you can say, so for instance, there were a bunch of countries which wanted, non-nuclear weapons countries wanted a legal opinion on what are the legal ramifications of having nuclear weapons and using nuclear weapons, whether that could ever be within the scope of international law. So, they went to the ICJ and got an advisory opinion on that. And this kind of thing also happens as well. So, so the key thing, remember, is ICJ, dispute of state between state. It's not the kind of situation where you want to prosecute someone for war crimes or crimes against humanity. That's the ICC, or like separate tribunals which are set up for unique situations. The ICJ is all about disputes between states.
So what is Ukraine's case based on? I'm guessing that they've approached both the ICJ and the ICC, if I'm not wrong. And also,
no, so the Ukraine has not approached the ICC. So because Ukraine, so the ICC is the International Criminal Court, is governed by what's called the Rome Statute. To be able to have a prosecution or to have someone to be prosecuted under that, the country to which they belong needs to be a party to the Rome Statute. And, it has to then allow a prosecution to take place. Also, generally, to bring about a prosecution, you need to be a member of the, you need to be a party to the Rome Statute as well, which Ukraine has not. It has not signed the Rome Statute, so it is not a party to it. But Ukraine signed a couple of declarations saying that we are okay with the ICC exercising jurisdiction on our territory, looking into any potential crimes against humanity or war crimes or anything on our territory. And the ICC prosecutor's office did its own preliminary examination. And now, after a bunch of other countries which are parties to the Rome Statute, 39 countries which are party to the Rome Statute, they have filed a referral to the ICC prosecutor's office saying, we think there are potential, war crimes and things have been committed on Ukrainian territory broadly by Russians, but, it's not specified as such. As a result, we think that the ICC prosecutor's office should launch an investigation. So that's how the ICC case is going on there, where now the ICC prosecutor is conducting an investigation. but that's
Okay.
not a case brought by Ukraine per se. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's just, it may seem a bit technical, but it's kind of important. It's very important in the international law framework. But
Yeah.
yes, Ukraine has filed a case in the International Court of Justice. So they
Okay.
have gone there, and there are two. So now the thing is that the case was filed on the 26th of February, so 2 days after the Russian invasion began. And there are two things which they're asking for there. As you mentioned already, at the outset, right at the start, they're asking for what are called provisional measures. Provisional measures are what, you'll have heard of interim orders, right? Interim
Yeah.
injunctions and things which we see in the domestic courts. Provisional measures are basically the international law equivalent of that. So what they're doing is they're saying, look, we have a dispute here with Russia. This is going to take some time for the court to actually resolve. So in the meanwhile, till, whatever determination you make on that dispute, as of now, there is, because while the court is going to hear it and listen to the arguments and all of that stuff is going to happen, it's going to take a bunch of time. If no action is taken, then, Ukraine is going to suffer irreparable prejudice, like harm which cannot be fixed afterwards. So, you know what, why don't you pass some provisional measures asking Russia to stand down? So that's sort of so that was what there was a hearing on 7th March. That's what was covered in that hearing, Ukraine making that request. The bigger case which Ukraine has filed against Russia, the broader thing is, so it's an interesting one actually, because Russia, when it launched its invasion on 24th February, Vladimir Putin, I don't know if you, if our readers have read through his speech, we have an article which kind of refers to that. We can have a link to that included in the description. Vladimir Putin justified the invasion, saying that, look, we are worried about a genocide of Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass region. There's been a lot of concerns we have for that. Plus, we're also a bit concerned about, this sort of that we are going to have to exercise our right to self-defense against, the Ukrainian government, which they consider to be illegitimate. And as you've heard, he also insists they're full of Nazis and all sorts of things. So he's saying, so Putin justified the whole thing, saying there is a risk of genocide to these people in this region, and for self-defense we're having to kind of go about this. Now this is because in international law it's no longer legal in international law to just invade another country. For centuries that was how countries operated, that you could have whatever dispute or reason or whatever, and you could basically invade, and that's just how it worked. Whereas post World War II, at least, I mean, even before that, there had been a consensus building about it. But post World War II, any war of aggression is illegal in international law. You can't use force against another country on their territory. You can't go into their country and get after them, unless you're satisfying very limited reasons. The only reason specified in the UN Charter is self-defense. Okay. And the other reason which has come up, which is considered over time, is to prevent genocide, or to prevent war crimes or crimes against humanity, but more specifically to prevent genocide, because the Genocide Convention of 1948, which again most countries are party to, includes not just a thing saying, oh, you must not commit genocide. It also says you must try to prevent genocide. So it can be, so this is an obligation which technically applies to a country that if it knows a genocide is being perpetrated in another neighboring country and it can stop it, it should go in to try and stop it technically. So so Putin is trying to justify his war using this point in particular, right? Because once you say that, oh, we're going in to stop a genocide, then it becomes difficult to say that war is illegal. What Ukraine have asked the ICJ to do is pass a ruling that there is no plausible case for genocide. That actually there's no serious evidence of genocide. There's no genuine claim of genocide being conducted by the Ukrainian government and its forces or people who it supports on Russian speakers in the Donbass or on those separatists, which is what Russia has been claiming. And I mean, it's true. If you look at, there's absolutely no factual basis for Russia to make that claim. There's been multiple UN missions, human rapporteurs reports, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, they've all gone to the region. Nothing has been found of any sort. Over the course of the whole conflict in eastern Ukraine over the last 8 years, right? Over the whole of that 8-year period, which includes when those separatist groups started fighting. It includes these separatist groups attacking the Ukrainian government forces, taking over cities, all of that, including everything, 14,000 people have lost their lives, which obviously is I mean, it's a serious thing, right? But I mean, just because a few people have lost their life doesn't mean genocide is taking place. It requires an intent, what's called a dolus specialis, a special intent to go in there and exterminate an entire population of people, right? Whether it's on an ethnic group or a religious group or a racial group, that's the idea behind what genocide is. You can't just throw around that term just for the heck of it.
Like, you can't just throw around the word genocide quite loosely.
It's a very, very serious thing.
Yeah.
And this was one of the points raised by Ukraine's counsel even yesterday at the ICJ, even though obviously, the issue is a provisional measures case. They were sort of explaining what their basic case is, and they were like, what Russia is doing is actually an abuse of the Genocide Convention, because if you start allowing countries to just use this like as a cynical little excuse for waltzing into another country's territory, I mean, the whole point of the Genocide Convention, which is supposed to be one of the most serious things, in international law, after what happened in World War II, right? It's after the whole, it's after the Holocaust that this whole thing came about. For that to be misused is, that itself is a violation of the convention, and it's a complete dishonor of everything which the convention is supposed to stand for. So that's the main case which Ukraine has, where they want the court to be able to pass a declaration, like a definitive declaration, saying that Russia's claims of genocide in the region are false and fabricated, and therefore Russia has no pretext for war. And that's kind of important, like in the grander scheme of things, that's a very important thing for Ukraine to be able to get, because, if we look at the way international relations work, right, the way the UN works, all of it requires the Security Council. Any binding action has to be taken by the Security Council. But the problem is that Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council, so they have a veto. So anytime, you can't really take a lot of action against Russia, sort of decisive action against them because of that veto at the Security Council. But if they get a declaration, at least it's kind of it helps them. It helps Ukraine in its relations going forward with other countries, with the world at large, if they get that declaration that Russia's whole war was illegal. And that can be done even if Russia decides not to engage with all of this, with the proceedings in the ICJ.
Okay. And of course, like, the big news coming from this entire ICJ hearing was also that Russia was a no-show. They just didn't turn up. And as we also touched upon it earlier, like, what does their absence also signal? And have they said anything regarding these hearings as well? Has there been any peep from Russia about what they think of these hearings? Or
I think by just refusing to take part in them, I think Russia sent the message it wants to send, right?
Okay.
I mean, the funny thing is that in a sense, what Russia is doing here is actually something which they're just actually following, funnily enough, in the footsteps of the USA. The USA has been taken to the ICJ in a few cases in the past, and like serious things. There's been the situation in Iran. There was the most famously a case which Nicaragua brought against the USA, right? Where because the US was funding rebels in Nicaragua against its democratically elected government, and the US was funding these guys. They themselves, they didn't send US troops on the ground, but they were sending, they were funding and controlling these militia groups, and these what later would be called even you had these Contra groups which were there in Iran and all as well. So essentially so Nicaragua took the US to the ICJ, saying that what the US has done is a violation of international law, even though they've not sent US military troops. They have, they've committed the use of force on our territory. They exercised effective control over these people who were, attacking our government and our people, and therefore, the US needs to be held responsible. And the US just refused to accept the court's jurisdiction. Like, they were just like, we don't accept this. And the court eventually said, so the court tried to give it an opportunity to be part of the proceedings. The US eventually refused. The court then conducted its proceedings without the US and eventually held against the US. But practically, effectively, it didn't matter because again, your enforcement of international law, your truly sort of binding things have to come from the Security Council. And the US could always just veto that. So that's, I think, sort of what Russia's channeling that right now, where they're just like, you know what, okay, you say we have done all of this. You can even find that what we've done is wrong. Because once the ICJ makes a finding, right, that there was no plausible case for genocide or no plausible case for self-defense, no plausible that the invasion of Ukraine was a war of aggression, then, I mean, it's clear that Russia has violated international law at that point. But the thing is, Russia is basically saying, you know what, you can find that. You could deliver a big fancy judgment saying all of that, but we don't care. Because you can't actually do anything to touch us, in terms of enforcement. I mean, of course, what we're seeing with the way the world has dealt with this situation, rather than relying on, say, a Security Council resolution calling for peace, which would have been binding, or a Security Council saying do certain things, the world is
Hmm.
now, the international community has looked to instead use sanctions as a way to deal with it, which don't have to come through the Security Council. They can, in fact, be imposed by the Security Council as well. But countries have the right to do this even outside of that, which is what they're all doing, which, the US is doing, the EU is doing, all these other, the UK is doing.
Yeah.
They're all imposing sanctions using the sort of right which they have to do that. So that's their way of kind of knowing them, because they know that they can't use what's supposed to be the real powerful tool to bind another country, which is a Security Council resolution. So instead, they're
Hmm.
using these other options. But
Okay.
essentially, Russia's just basically their point is that, look, we know. I think it's almost that Russia know that what they've done is incorrect, right? I mean, like
Hmm.
they know what they've done, right?
Yeah.
So there's no point trying to go and waste their time arguing in the ICJ that, oh, you know what, we have this. Because then if they try, the moment they start having to say, oh, look, actually, look, we have evidence to prove what we're saying, then they have to actually put that evidence in the court, right? Which they
Hmm.
don't want to do.
Yeah.
And part of it is, I think they just don't want to recognize the legitimacy of this whole process. So they're just like, you know what, we don't care. You can conduct
Yeah.
whatever proceedings you want. It doesn't matter to us. And this
Hmm.
applies not just to the main case, but even to the provisional measures as well, right? I mean, if
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
tomorrow, because the ICJ said they will fast track the thing, they will try and give a decision as soon as possible. They could tomorrow come and say, you know what, provisional measure, Russia should cease fire, stop its attacks, come to the court and discuss what its issues are with Ukraine, blah blah blah. They could say all of those things, and Russia can just be like, we're not going to bother. What are you going to do, right?
Hmm.
So I mean that order could help provide further backing for more sanctions and that kind of thing, but it doesn't. It doesn't automatically lead to any sort of enforcement action on Russia. So that's sort of
Okay.
what I think. That's what they're
Yeah.
planning
Now,
to do.
Kasha, the big question which I really want to ask you is that how likely is Putin or anyone else from his regime as well involved in the invasion of Ukraine to stand trial
Mhm.
for war crimes or crimes against humanity? Like, how likely is that
Yeah.
scenario of Putin being really being
So
arrested
yeah,
for this?
so I mean, the key thing to remember is that this would not be something for the ICJ to consider. The
Yeah.
ICJ would not be considering individual criminal responsibility. So the ICJ can hear if Ukraine, so Ukraine, for instance, in its provisional measures argument, has raised the argument that Russia is committing war crimes, right?
Hmm.
The ICJ can hear a state's complaint. So they can hear a complaint by Ukraine saying that Russia is committing war crimes. They can use that as a ground for granting provisional measures. They can use that as a ground for later saying, okay, you know what, reparations are due, violations
Hmm.
took place. But the ICJ doesn't deal with the prosecution of individuals. So whether it's Putin or whether it's the military commander responsible for a massacre, the ICJ will not deal with that. That's where the ICC is supposed to come in. Okay.
Hmm.
Now, till the ICC was formed with the Rome Statute, the general funda was that if you had that once a war and an armed conflict, more precisely, is over, once it's over, the international community will then set up these international tribunals. They will set up tribunals for each of those incidents, which will
Hmm.
then pick up, look at individual responsibility of particular, whether it's military leaders or politicians who are involved with any atrocities which were committed, and they will then and that tribunal will then hear the case. So that's what you had with the Nuremberg tribunals, right? With the
Hmm.
Nuremberg trials which took place, or the Tokyo trials which took place after World War II. You had the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia, which is the same thing for what's the Serbians were committing genocide on ethnic Albanians and Bosnians, and the whole
Hmm.
horrible situation which was happening in Yugoslavia in the 90s, right? Or you have,
Hmm.
even there was a tribunal for Rwanda, an international criminal tribunal for Rwanda, which dealt with the Rwandan genocide.
Okay.
So that is the traditional method which was followed. And in a sense, once this conflict between Ukraine and Russia ends, so suppose Russia loses this war, right?
Hmm.
Then there is a possibility, especially if there's a regime change in Russia, that you could then have a specialized tribunal set up to look
Hmm.
at war crimes by Russia in the course of this war.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's a tricky thing. That requires, as I said, Russia to lose the war and to have a regime change for that to happen. So that's pretty
Hmm.
unlikely. The other option, obviously, is the International Criminal Court, which we mentioned. It's set up by this thing called the Rome Statute. This happened sort of in around 98 to 2000 was when you had all these negotiations. Countries were ratifying it by 2000. But many countries refused to be part of it because they didn't want their individuals to potentially be prosecuted for this. So, for instance, the US, famously, not part of the ICC, because at the end of the thing about it, right?
Yeah.
Someone like George Bush could get hauled up. You don't want that to happen, so you know what? We're not party to it. Russia was a part, had signed it. It hadn't ratified it. It had signed it, but in 2016, after the office of the ICC prosecutor termed what was happening in Crimea as an occupation, the Russians pulled out. Since they hadn't ratified it, it didn't still have power over them anyway. But they even withdrew their signature from it. Now the thing is, if a country hasn't signed or ratified the Rome Statute, there are still some ways in which you can get a person who's in charge there to be prosecuted by the ICC. So, for instance, whether it's Putin or whether it's the military advisors, what you can have is that other countries issue arrest warrants for them. And the moment they step foot on any country which is a party to the Rome Statute, then they can be arrested there and then sent to the ICC for trial. So this is something which, for instance, was what they tried to do with this, Bashir, the guy who was the dictator in Sudan. There's a Liberian dictator who the same thing was done with, where he was arrested on a foreign country. He eventually was acquitted by the ICC, but that's how you kind of go about it. That's one way, which, for instance, here, even though Russia is not a party to the Rome Statute, it is possible that now that the ICC prosecutor has opened an investigation, once that investigation is done, if they say, yes, there is enough evidence to prosecute these people for war crimes or crimes against humanity, which are, by the way, very specific things in international law. Okay, like war crimes generally are grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. So things like attacking, willful killing of civilians, attacks on hospitals, ambulances, killing prisoners of war, those kind of things. That's so that's what war crimes generally cover. Crimes against you, and even, for instance, like if soldiers go and commit rape as a tool of mass violence, or enforce disappearances of people, all of these things can fall within war crimes, where they're sort of just these events which take place in the course of an armed conflict or a war. Yeah, so that's what war crimes are. Crimes against humanity are where a sort of systematic, widespread attack against a civilian population takes place by armed forces, where and again, it can cover murders, torture, enforced disappearances, rape, and sort of sexual violence, forcing women into sexual slavery, kidnappings, deportations, all these things, when there's part of a widespread systematic attempt to kind of go after a particular civilian population, that's that all comes within crimes against humanity. So these are very specific offenses which exist under international criminal and humanitarian law. Now, the thing is that it is possible that once the ICC finishes this investigation, says, look, we have evidence against these Russian military leaders, against this Russian-backed separatist, against Putin himself. And the process then is, however, that Russia is never going to agree to hand over these people unless, again, regime change happens, right? Which is, it's always a possibility, but it's a it's a difficult and unlikely thing to pin your hopes on. But if they don't, then there is a possibility that you say, okay, when Putin or any of these other people leave their country, right? They go to another country. Like suppose they visit the UK, they visit. There's 123 countries are parties to the Rome Statute, right? So it could be a bunch of countries in Africa, like Ivory Coast or Senegal. It could be the UK. It could be Lithuania. It could be Vanuatu if he ever decides to go to like the Pacific. So if he goes to any of these countries, if any of these people who are individuals who are considered to be responsible for those war crimes or crimes against humanity goes to any of these countries, they can be arrested there. Now, with Putin himself, that again is tricky because he's a head of state, right? So unless he's not a head of state, he has diplomatic protection. It becomes really hard to be able to arrest someone, even when you're dealing with things like crimes against humanity and stuff, for which technically you can say that, the diplomatic immunity and protection doesn't apply. There are arguments to do it, even though that's not always possible. But even for that, because he's a head of state, because of the way it's supposed to work, it would be really, really hard to do. So your best case chance really is either some country deciding to be really, really bold and brave and do it, or that the day Putin, is no longer in charge of Russia, then you can look to arrest him, whether in Russia or outside. Realistically, let's be honest, Putin's not really going to face any prosecution for this. and probably unlikely for any of the military leaders as well. At this point, in terms of what kind of violations we're hearing of indiscriminate attacks. We know we've seen some attacks on civilians. The Ukrainian government has presented to the ICJ what they, evidence of attacks on hospitals, on ambulances carrying injured soldiers, on even just random civilians. So these all things would count as war crimes under the the existing rules of what it looks like. But in terms of really being able to prosecute anyone for this, I would be very surprised. I think the best chance probably will be this ICJ case, even if Russia doesn't get involved. Ukraine should be able to get findings in its favor there.
Yeah.
But will it be able to get anything enforced against Russia? That's a different matter. Under an international mechanism, probably not really, given Russia's veto on the P5. But I mean, obviously, countries can still file their sanctions and take the actions they can to try and put the squeeze on Russia in whichever ways they can. So that's pretty much the real. If you're really looking at a way for that to happen, sanctions are pretty much the best way, because you can sanction individuals as well, right? So right now, what's happening is Putin, a lot of military leaders, his government leaders, they're all now, there are sanctions against them individually. So that's probably the best chance of making them pay in some way, because getting a conviction from an international criminal court will probably be quite difficult.
So, and Putin also will be, I'm quite sure, aware of all these factors of him being arrested too. Like, he's not just going to stroll around to Vanuatu anytime soon. So
he'll be very careful where he goes.
So we are not going to see, like, honestly, we're not going to see a prosecution any from the Russian.
It would be great if it happened, but I'd be very surprised.
That will be a news day for sure. But Vakasha, thank you so much again for coming on the podcast. It's always a pleasure. And that's the end of the episode, listeners. If you like listening to this episode, subscribe to the Big Story podcast. We're available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts as well. If you liked listening to this episode, please subscribe to The Big Story for episodic updates. We're available on Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, JioSaavn, and most of the other popular podcast streaming platforms. For other podcasts, please log on to the Quint website, and for any feedback, please shoot an email to podcast@thequint.com.
Thanks for listening. Log on to the Quint's website and check out our other podcasts.